Hello. Throughout this recent series on Donald Trump, I've frequently discussed the moves that he's been making that have been related to Europe. Specifically, he's called for more defence spending in Europe, and especially in NATO allies. He's pursued a ceasefire in Ukraine, albeit to little success, and he's negotiated a trade deal with the UK. But every time I've discussed Europe recently, it's been through the lens of Trump. But the EU in its own right is a topic very much worth discussing. So today, as I reach the end of this series on Donald Trump, I'm going to zoom out and take a look at our geopolitical world from above and the regions that will play a key role in determining the future direction that this world heads in. I'll start this today through individual analysis of the European Union. Specifically, I'll explore the history of the European Union. I'll explore current members of the EU before delving into more detail on countries who have aspirations to join the EU. Over the next few episodes, I'll dive into issues such as technology, innovation, economics, and trade. I'll also explore potential hotspots that exist within the EU before finally exploring, when all is said and done, what will the EU be known for? Let's dive in. When it comes to discussing the history of Europe, we could travel back centuries. We could discuss the Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans. We could discuss the Napoleonic Wars and the concept of Europe. But if I delve into this much detail, this podcast episode will be quite a long one. So I'm going to start in the aftermath of World War II with a little bit of background on the build-up to the Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I aimed to ensure that Germany wouldn't be in a position to launch an attack on Europe again. Germany accepted full blame for the war, but it also had to pay 6.6 billion euros in reparations. This put Germany in a economically weakened position, and it wasn't realistic that they would ever have been able to pay this amount of reparations. The League of Nations was also formed, but the United States wasn't included, and so the group lacked power and influence. The crushing impacts on Germany led to the Weimar inflation, and a few years later, the Great Depression emerged in the United States. During times of societal struggle, such as seen through economic crisis when inflation eats away at purchasing power, or when rising unemployment sees income dramatically reduced, people generally become restless. They see that something has to change because they can't continue under the current norm. This hope for change is often seen via a political transition towards populism, where stronger leaders who exist at the far ends of the political scale rise up and paint themselves as the change that is necessary. This is what contributed to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and it's also a trend that we're seeing unfold in many nations around the world today. But I will dive into this in a future episode. The most important takeaway here is that the post-World War I strategy was botched, and so after World War II, they had to get it right. A large part of this came through European integration, which had been the key battleground for both world wars. In the aftermath of World War II, we entered the Bretton Woods system, the aim of which was to create economic stability that wouldn't lead to another Weimar inflation or another Great Depression that could potentially spiral into another war. We've gone through different versions of Bretton Woods since then, but importantly, this set the foundation that was built upon, leading to the world in which we live today. This was especially seen in Europe through many different measures. Firstly, in 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was established. 6 countries, who were France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, created this to bind their coal and steel industries. Both were critical materials at the time, and so under this agreement, if these nations were to go to war against each other, this could cause them some serious pain. This was one of the first deterrents that was introduced, hoping to lead the nations in Europe against war. In 1957, the European Economic Community and Euratom were established. The first created a common market which laid the groundwork for European economic cooperation, while the second created a nuclear energy community. It was these two, along with the European coal and steel community, that were seen as predecessors to the EU. And so when I dive into the member states later on, it will be from this point that many of them had joined what later became the EU. We also saw this cooperation take a step further in 1986 when the Single European Act created the single market, promoting the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And then we finally arrived at the birth of the European Union as marked by the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. This saw foreign policy, security, justice, and currency cooperation between the member states. And while this marks the official birth of the EU, the previous establishments clearly indicate that it took decades of effort for us to get to this point. So now that we're at the beginning of the EU, let's quickly cover who is involved here. So, breaking down the member states of the EU and when they became a member is as follows. The founders are Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In Denmark and Ireland then joined in 1973, followed by Greece in 1981, and Portugal and Spain in 1986. In 1995, we saw Austria, Finland, and Sweden join. And then we took quite a jump to 2004 when we saw a large list of countries join. This included Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. After this, we saw Bulgaria and Romania join in 2007, and Croatia joined in 2013. Now, as I'm sure we all remember, the UK was also a former member state of the European Union. They joined in 1973, but they left via the Brexit process in 2020. When exploring this list, the first thing that jumps out at me here is how important the Cold War was, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the eventual accession of the former Warsaw Pact nations into the European Union. This truly turned the European Union into a sheer mass of collected nations that it is today. Before this, it was largely Western Europe, with some of the countries in Scandinavia and other nations scattered about. But the bloc today has become what it is, largely due to the mass of nations that joined in 2004, and these were largely former Warsaw Pact states. Outside of the EU members, there are also 9 states that are recognised as potential EU candidates. These are Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine. Kosovo has also applied for the European Union membership in 2022. Of these nations, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, North Macedonia, Moldova, and Ukraine are in active negotiations. Accession to the European Union and the criteria for this is included in the Copenhagen criteria and the Maastricht Treaty, specifically Article 49 of the Maastricht Treaty. When we are exploring these hopeful members of the EU, it can be boiled down into three groups. Firstly, those in the Balkans. Secondly, the group of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, which is known as the Association Trio. And finally, in its own group, we have Turkey. Of the Balkans, Croatia, which is already a member of the European Union, is the most economically developed. Despite being a part of the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, Croatia today shows little sign of the physical impact of this conflict. The impacts of the war on Serbia are more psychological in nature, with one street in Belgrade marked by a sign stating, quote, "The only genocide in the Balkans was against the Serbs." However, the nation that shows the most physical impact to this day of the Balkan War is Bosnia and Herzegovina, where bullet holes remain in buildings in both Mostar and Sarajevo, and museums continue to keep the effects of this conflict very much alive. On exploring the wider region of the Balkans, as I discussed in my Balkans update a few months ago, tensions do remain geopolitically in the Balkans due to demographics. There exists a large Serbian population in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Montenegro. These could one day lead to potential sparks. Also, in the case of Kosovan independence, this is still not recognised by 5 EU member states, and of course by Serbia. But some agreements have been formulated in recent years, including a recognition by Serbia of Kosovan vehicle registration plates. If any of these sparks were to light, this would likely slow the European accession process for any of the countries that I've mentioned. If we move on to Albania and North Macedonia, they both started their accession processes in 2020, and when I visited, both struck me as nations that are on the rise, especially in the tourism sector. In a decade, I could visualise Europeans heading to Skopje and Tirana for summer weekend trips, and both possess a rich history. Tirana also has the advantage that it sits close to the Adriatic, and it was very warm when I visited in January, so in the summer it would likely be even hotter. So the Balkans still have issues to address as a wider region, but the European Union is being touted as likely to play a key role in the future of many of these nations. Now, moving on to the association trio, and this is where we can introduce Russia into the picture. Ukraine is, of course, embroiled in war with Russia, but EU accession for Ukraine has been discussed as a potential strategy that would see the country integrated more into Europe in terms of trade and technology. However, with the war showing few signs of stopping, even with temporary ceasefires and talks occurring between the two sides, this accession for Ukraine likely won't come soon. As for Georgia and Moldova, they are currently travelling in opposite directions when it comes to potential EU membership. Last year, the pro-EU presidential candidate in Moldova, Maya Sandu, won re-election in what will be her second and final term. At the same time as this presidential election, there was another vote within Moldova in which the country marginally voted yes to implement EU membership into the country's constitution. However, on the flip side, Georgia's election last year saw the ruling Georgian Dream Party delay talks with the EU until at least 2028. Some analysts have seen this as Russian influence, with the Georgian Dream Party typically seen as pro-Russian. But the Prime Minister has stated that he wants Georgia to join the EU in a position of strength, especially economic and political strength, and he doesn't want to join the EU as a lifeline. Regardless of interpretation here, which I will leave up to you, progress towards potential EU membership for Georgia has clearly taken a hit. Finally, we have Turkey. For years, France has been interpreted as attempting to block Turkey's EU accession process, and many other EU members have also engaged in similar efforts. In 2005, the French foreign minister stated it would be difficult to admit Turkey without an EU constitution due to unclear rules on communal living. In 2007, the president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, reiterated this sentiment, and he doubled down on this further in 2011 when he stated that Turkey was, quote, unfit for EU membership. This process of Turkey and potential EU membership is now frozen due to EU sanctions after Turkey refused to open its ports to Greek Cypriot vessels. In 2017, EU officials stated that the 2017 Turkish constitutional referendum would violate the Copenhagen criteria for EU membership, and Turkey responded by blocking cooperation with NATO partner countries, many of which, as we know, are in the European Union. So, talks remain suspended here, and no progress will come unless we see a change in policy from the Turks or the European Union. Of the other nations in Europe, Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland have submitted applications in the past, but they have subsequently froze or withdrew these. Despite this, Norway and Switzerland, as well as Liechtenstein, remain heavily integrated into Europe, participating in the EU single market and the Schengen area. None, however, are in the EU customs union. So we now know who is in the European Union, who hopes to be in the European Union, and whose processes of accession have come to a grinding halt. We can now dive into the specifics. So next time, I will discuss what economics and trade looks like in the European Union. Until then, I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.